The forest whispered secrets that no outsider dared hear, and the Kentucky woods of 1870 were particularly unforgiving that winter. Among the twisted oaks and snow-covered underbrush stood a lone cabin, its chimney coughing thin gray smoke into the bitter air. Inside, a doctor moved silently through dim corridors, his spectacles reflecting the flickering candlelight as he inspected instruments that gleamed with polished precision. In the shadows of the room, his daughter sat quietly, her eyes wide and hesitant, a growing heaviness to her body that made her every movement a struggle. She did not speak unless spoken to, and even then, her words were measured, careful, as though the wrong sound might draw his ire. At night, the cabin seemed to breathe, the walls echoing strange murmurs and the soft scratching of unseen creatures. She often thought she heard voices calling her name, whispers that seemed to drift from beneath the floorboards where her father had forbidden her to go. Sometimes, when the fire sputtered low, she glimpsed strange contraptions hidden behind curtains or beneath tables, tubes and vials, charts with her own name scrawled in meticulous handwriting, and instruments she did not dare touch. He called it care. He called it science. But in the cold light of night, she began to feel the weight of obsession pressing down, a suffocating attention that turned the very air into a cage. She could not remember a time when she had felt free. Even the few visitors who dared approach the cabin spoke of an unnatural silence and a sense that the doctor was always watching, always measuring, always calculating. The deeper she descended into the labyrinth of her father's designs, the more the line between protection and punishment blurred. Every whisper, every shadow, every soft creak of the cabin floor seemed like a warning. Escape was a thought better left unspoken. Yet the voices in the dark called to her relentlessly, urging her to question the world her father had so carefully built, a world in which love had been replaced by obsession, and a daughter had become an experiment. In the remote, frozen expanse of 1870 Kentucky, the doctor's cabin seemed to exist outside of time, hidden deep within the tangled embrace of the forest where sunlight barely reached the ground. The path to the cabin was little more than a rough trail, overgrown with brambles and broken branches that scratched at any traveler who dared approach. Few in the nearby villages knew of its exact location, and fewer still would have considered venturing there willingly. The cabin itself was small and unassuming from the outside, with weathered wood blackened by decades of wind and rain, its windows clouded with grime and age. Smoke curled intermittently from the crooked chimney, but the thin wisp of warmth it promised was deceptive, failing to reach the frozen soil that surrounded the dwelling. The isolation was total, the nearest neighbor lived hours away, and in the winter months, even those tenuous connections with the outside world seemed impossibly distant. Inside, the cabin was warm enough to keep the chill at bay, yet the atmosphere was thick with a sense of foreboding. The doctor moved with the quiet precision of a man accustomed to solitude, his footsteps deliberate and measured on the uneven wooden floorboards. Each corner of the cabin held the faint odor of chemicals and herbs, a mixture that spoke of experiments carried out in secrecy and obsession. Shelves lined with jars, vials, and bundles of dried plants reflected his meticulous care, and the faint glint of metal instruments hinted at practices both medical and sinister. Despite the outward appearance of a simple home, there was an undeniable undercurrent of control in the air, a sense that every object and every sound was placed and managed with the same exacting attention he applied to his daughter. His daughter, a young girl already showing the effects of her unusual growth, lived entirely under his scrutiny. Her movements were watched with constant calculation, her diet measured with meticulous care, and her education shaped entirely within the boundaries he set. The world outside their cabin was almost non-existent in her life, the forest surrounding them acted as both protector and prison, shielding her from outsiders while simultaneously isolating her from human contact. Stories circulated in the nearby towns, half-whispered rumors about the doctor and his solitary life, speculation about the strange noises that sometimes drifted from the woods at night, but no one dared approach. There was an unspoken understanding among the villagers that the doctor's knowledge, skill, and obsession placed him beyond their scrutiny, and that the cabin in the woods was a place where ordinary rules did not apply. In that isolated space, the doctor's attention to his daughter was absolute. There was no escape from his watchful eyes, no distraction from his experiments and manipulations, and no relief from the tension that filled every corner of the cabin. The forest beyond remained silent, the wind moaning softly through the trees, as if even nature itself understood the peculiar and haunting reality of the house that sat hidden among the Kentucky oaks. The daughter's unusual size had always set her apart, a visible mark that drew both fascination and fear from anyone who glimpsed her, though in truth, very few had. Her father's attention to her body was relentless, calculated with a precision that left no detail unchecked. Each meal she consumed was measured, each movement noted, each symptom or change meticulously recorded in journals and ledgers that filled the small study in their cabin. It was not concern for her health that drove him but a consuming obsession with control and transformation, the belief that he alone possessed the knowledge and skill to shape her into something beyond ordinary. In the quiet moments of the evening, while the fire's glow danced across the wooden walls, he would sit by her side, instructing her on posture, breathing, and exercise, his tone both clinical and almost tender, yet underlined with a pressure that left no room for resistance. She had learned early to obey, to comply, for any hesitation or defiance brought a look of disappointment that chilled her far more than the biting cold outside ever could. The daughter's growth was a source of endless fascination to him, a living subject for his theories and experiments. He was obsessed with the interplay of diet, physiology, and behavior, convinced that the extraordinary size of her body was both a problem to be managed and an opportunity to uncover hidden truths about the human form. He would lift weights for her to move, administer strange concoctions meant to stimulate or suppress, and chart her responses with the meticulous care of a man possessed. Though she understood little of the science behind it, she could feel the weight of his expectations pressing down on her, a constant reminder that her life was inseparable from the purpose he had imposed. Her own desires, whims, or discomforts were secondary, diminished beneath the magnitude of his attention and the endless experiments that defined their existence. At times, her reflection in the cabin's darkened windows or the polished surfaces of the instruments revealed not only her body but also a growing awareness of her confinement. She saw herself as both participant and prisoner, an observer of her own transformation and yet powerless to alter the course her father had charted. The outside world existed only as rumor and shadow, the villagers' whispers carried on the wind, stories of fear and speculation that never reached beyond the forest. Within the cabin, there was no other influence, no one to provide guidance or comfort, and even the forest itself seemed complicit in her isolation, dense and forbidding, a natural barrier that reinforced the boundaries her father had set. Her body, already burdened with weight and the strain it imposed, became a site of tension and vulnerability. Each experiment left traces, aches, bruises, emotional scars, that accumulated quietly, unnoticed by the world outside. She learned to navigate the strange routines imposed on her, to obey without question, and to endure without complaint, all under the constant scrutiny of a father whose fascination had crossed the boundary between care and obsession. Beneath the cabin, hidden from sight even to the daughter, lay a basement that seemed almost alive with secrets. The narrow staircase leading downward creaked under each cautious step, its wood warped and shadowed, smelling faintly of damp earth and something sharper, chemical and metallic, that lingered in the corners. The doctor had always warned her to stay away, claiming the area was dangerous, that the air itself carried risks she could not comprehend. Yet even from the upper floor, faint sounds sometimes drifted upward, the clink of glass, the soft thump of a rolling instrument, or the subtle hiss of heated metal meeting liquid. At first, the noises were small, almost ignorable, dismissed as the natural settling of the old cabin. But as she grew older, they became persistent, almost purposeful, like a heartbeat echoing through the floorboards, calling her attention to the space below. It was not long before curiosity, mingled with fear, drew her closer. One evening, when her father was absorbed in recording measurements and noting reactions in his journals, she dared to approach the basement door. The handle was cold beneath her hand, and the faint illumination that escaped from beneath the threshold cast long, tremulous shadows across the wooden planks of the main room. She hesitated, heart hammering, yet the need to understand what lay beneath her father's strict control outweighed the fear. Each step down the narrow stairwell revealed more of the strange world hidden from her eyes, the air thickening with the scent of herbs, oils, and something indefinably pungent, a chemical tang that pricked at her nose and stung her lungs. The basement itself was a chamber of secrets, a convergence of science and obsession, where the doctor's intellect and fixations materialized into objects both fascinating and horrifying. Shelves lined the walls with bottles of liquids in colors that seemed unnatural, suspended between transparency and darkness, their contents swirling when disturbed. Tables were covered in instruments, some familiar and mundane, others so strange and intricate that their purpose was a mystery even to her father's careful explanation. Charts and diagrams adorned the walls, sometimes with sketches of her own body, each measurement and annotation meticulously recorded, as if the walls themselves were a ledger of her existence. Candles and lanterns flickered, casting trembling shadows that seemed to move of their own accord, lending the space an almost animate quality. Every visit to the basement became a test of courage and observation. She began to notice subtle details, the faint scorch marks on a table edge, the small stains on the floor that were never explained, the way her father's instruments were arranged with obsessive symmetry. The more she watched, the more she realized that the basement was not merely a place of study, but a theater of control, a space where her father's fixation took tangible form. Within its confines, she could feel the weight of his presence even when he was absent, as though the very walls had absorbed his attention, his meticulousness, and his obsession. The basement was a world unto itself, and in it, the boundaries between care, curiosity, and cruelty began to blur into something far darker than she had ever imagined. The first experiment began on a morning when the air in the cabin was heavy with frost, and the silence of the forest outside pressed against the walls like a living thing. Her father entered her room with a calm, measured demeanor, carrying a small tray of instruments and glass vials whose contents shimmered strangely in the weak sunlight filtering through the grimy windows. He spoke to her in a tone that blended instruction with persuasion, convincing her that this procedure was meant to help her, to ease the burdens her body carried and to refine the extraordinary potential he believed lay within her. She had learned through countless days and nights that to refuse him was to invite a subtle but unmistakable disappointment, and so she complied, moving with careful obedience as he directed, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared herself for whatever was to come. The basement, now familiar yet still menacing, became the stage for the experiment. He guided her to a narrow platform, carefully adjusting her posture, explaining the purpose of each instrument with meticulous clarity. Some were simple enough, measuring and recording her responses, but others were strange and intrusive, designed to probe the boundaries of her body in ways she had not yet imagined. He spoke of precision, of progress, of science, yet beneath each word lingered an intensity that pressed against her like the very walls around them. The flickering candlelight cast long, distorted shadows across the floor, and the instruments gleamed with a cold promise that left her heart hammering in rhythm with the soft, unnatural sounds of metal meeting flesh. As the procedure began, she felt sensations that were unfamiliar, sharp, and sometimes uncomfortable. Each movement, each adjustment of her body, was monitored, measured, and noted in the doctor's careful hand, yet there was no malice in his expression, only a relentless focus that made it difficult to distinguish care from cruelty. The vials of liquid, some bitter, some strangely metallic, were administered with precise timing, and she could feel her own body responding in ways that were both frightening and confusing. Her breaths became shallow, her muscles tense, and a dull ache settled in places she had not realized could feel pain in such intimate detail. Throughout the ordeal, her mind raced with questions she dared not voice. Was this truly care, or was it something darker? Could she ever escape the constant scrutiny, the measurement, the transformation? She caught glimpses of herself in the reflective surfaces of the instruments, seeing a girl already marked by the obsession of another, her body a canvas for experiments that carried both promise and terror. Yet she endured, because to resist would have been to challenge him directly, and she had long ago learned that obedience was safer than confrontation. The first experiment ended as it had begun, quietly and without ceremony, leaving her shaken yet alive, her body and mind forever altered by the realization that the boundaries of her father's obsession were deeper, more invasive, and more terrifying than she had ever imagined, and that this was only the beginning of a journey she could not foresee. Nightfall brought with it a deep, oppressive stillness that seemed to seep into every corner of the cabin, pressing against walls and furniture alike, and the daughter lay awake in her bed, listening to the subtle, almost imperceptible creaks of the old wood as if the house itself were breathing. The shadows from the fire danced on the ceiling, elongating and twisting into forms that seemed alive, and somewhere in the distance, the wind whispered through the trees with a cadence that suggested speech. At first, she tried to dismiss the sounds as mere imagination, the product of a restless mind or the natural groaning of the cabin settling into the frozen ground. Yet the murmurs persisted, faint at first, almost playful, then gradually sharpening into distinct, unmistakable voices calling her name, urging her to move, to look, to act. Sometimes, they sounded like echoes of herself, whispering thoughts she could not consciously acknowledge, and at other times, the voices carried a cold authority that seemed alien and threatening, as though other presences shared the cabin with her, unseen but aware. The daughter began to notice patterns in these voices, subtle rhythms and repetitions that drew her attention to parts of the house she had previously avoided. The basement, forbidden and dark, seemed to pulse with a quiet resonance, the whispers guiding her ears toward its shadowed door, toward the floorboards that concealed her father's instruments, and toward the objects that had become symbols of control over her body and mind. Sometimes, the voices mimicked the tones of those she knew, imitating the warmth of her father's instructions, only to twist them into something menacing and incomprehensible. Each night, as the darkness thickened and the candlelight flickered, the whispers grew more insistent, urging questions she dared not ask aloud and planting ideas that felt both dangerous and tantalizing. Fear and curiosity battled within her, leaving her unable to rest. She would lie in bed, listening to the cadence of the murmurs, feeling the floorboards vibrate faintly beneath her as if they were responding to her thoughts. Occasionally, she imagined shadowy figures moving just beyond the reach of the lamplight, their presence implied rather than seen, their motives unknowable. Sleep became a tenuous thing, broken by sudden awakenings in which the voices seemed louder, more urgent, sometimes pleading, sometimes commanding, sometimes mocking. The line between imagination and reality blurred, and she could no longer be certain whether the whispers were the product of her own fear, a trick of the winter wind through the trees, or the restless echoes of other victims who had once been drawn into her father's labyrinth of obsession. The persistent voices began to change her perception of the cabin itself. Walls that had seemed protective during the day now felt like barriers trapping her in a living puzzle, the instruments and charts in the basement taking on a sinister life of their own. Every object seemed charged with memory and intent, a participant in the constant dialogue of sound and shadow. The whispers, though never fully understood, guided her awareness, sharpening her observation of the subtle movements, the small details, the rhythms of her father's presence and absence. In the darkness, she became a listener above all else, attuned to the murmurs that wove around her, shaping her thoughts, her fears, and her understanding of the isolated, controlled world she could neither leave nor fully comprehend. The people in the nearby villages had long sensed that something was not quite right about the doctor and his daughter, though fear and superstition kept them from ever approaching too closely. Rumors moved quietly from house to house, whispered over firesides and behind shutters, stories of strange lights flickering in the woods at night, of low, unnatural sounds that seemed to float through the trees, and of a girl who was rarely seen outside the cabin, yet whose presence was unmistakable in fleeting glimpses along the forest edge. Some claimed to have glimpsed her silhouette through the frost-streaked windows, her figure unusually large and awkward, moving in ways that suggested both grace and strain. Others reported glimpses of the doctor himself, always precise and deliberate, carrying strange instruments or bundles that no one could identify, vanishing behind the thick walls of his isolated home as if swallowed whole by the forest. The combination of the daughter's unusual size and the father's meticulous, almost obsessive behavior created an air of unease that spread slowly through the small communities, lingering like a shadow that could not be touched but could not be ignored. The neighbors' curiosity was always tempered by fear, a knowledge that the doctor's skill in medicine and his reputation for intelligence made him a man beyond ordinary reproach. Some said he had once saved lives in the county, treating illnesses that others could not, and his knowledge of anatomy and chemistry was widely respected, a power that made confrontation seem dangerous. But despite the outward respect, suspicion grew quietly, fueled by unexplained occurrences. Livestock sometimes went missing near the edge of the forest, and strange odors were occasionally noticed drifting from the direction of the cabin. Children dared each other to approach the path, only to flee when the wind carried a distant voice, deep and commanding, that seemed to mock them or warn them away. These small incidents, multiplied over seasons, reinforced the sense that the doctor's life was governed by rules outside normal understanding, a life in which the boundaries between safety and danger, care and obsession, were perilously thin. Among the villagers, the sense of unease became almost palpable during the long, dark winters, when the forest seemed to press inward, and the silence of snow-covered trees amplified every creak and murmur from the cabin. Even those who had never set eyes on the daughter felt the weight of her absence from the social life of the county, the way she did not attend gatherings or appear on the roads like other children. And yet, in their quiet moments, when shadows fell long across their hearths, they could not entirely escape the thought of her, of the isolation, of the instruments and experiments that might be carried out in the basement below the flickering candlelight. Suspicion became a living thing, feeding itself on fragments of rumor, on half-seen figures, on the whispers of the wind through the trees, until the doctor and his daughter were no longer simply neighbors, they had become a presence that haunted the village, a dark question mark looming on the edge of the known world. The unease eventually reached a point where even the most cautious could not ignore it entirely, prompting hushed conversations about whether intervention was necessary, whether some unseen harm was being done in the shadowed cabin. But every plan to approach the isolated dwelling faltered under the weight of fear and uncertainty. The forest, the snow, and the doctor's own reputation conspired to keep the villagers at bay, leaving the cabin and its inhabitants shrouded in secrecy. The daughter remained hidden, her life observed only through fleeting glimpses and whispered conjecture. As the tension in the community grew, a quiet storm of fear and suspicion that promised confrontation yet delayed it, keeping the mystery alive in the minds of those who dared to watch from afar. As the daughter grew older, the careful obedience that had once come naturally began to waver, replaced by a quiet, simmering resistance she barely acknowledged even to herself. She had spent countless hours under her father's watchful eyes, enduring the strict routines and invasive experiments that defined her existence, yet the isolation of the cabin and the oppressive weight of his scrutiny had begun to stir a hunger for autonomy within her. At first, it was subtle, small acts of defiance, like hesitating before following an instruction or secretly observing her father's actions before complying. She learned to mask her true feelings with a practiced calm, nodding in agreement while her mind raced with questions about his methods, his obsessions, and the life he had constructed for her. Every word she spoke, every movement she made, was now measured not just for obedience but for opportunity, a way to gather knowledge that might one day give her leverage, a sliver of control over a world that had been entirely dominated by another. Her rebellion was cautious, shaped by fear as much as curiosity, because she understood the consequences of overt resistance. The basement, with its strange instruments and charts detailing her body, became a focus for her observation. She studied the placement of the tools, the timing of her father's movements, and the subtle rhythms in his routines, all while pretending to comply fully with his demands. She began to notice inconsistencies, moments when his attention wavered or when a small error in his calculations suggested that he was not infallible. Each discovery fueled a sense of empowerment, a quiet conviction that the authority he wielded was not absolute, that even in a life dominated by obsession and control, there were openings, gaps she could exploit if she moved carefully. Her awareness sharpened, and she began keeping mental notes of the experiments, tracking which methods caused discomfort, which evoked fear, and which seemed to hold the most sway over her father's emotions. She experimented in her own way, subtly resisting the vials, altering the timing of movements, and observing his reactions with painstaking attention. The process was slow, delicate, and perilous. A single misstep could provoke anger or suspicion, undoing all the progress she had made. Yet the act of resistance, even in its smallest forms, imbued her with a sense of purpose, a recognition that she was no longer merely a subject of his obsession but an active participant in a precarious game of control. As she navigated this tense dance, she also began to reflect on the boundaries of her captivity. The forest, the cabin, and the basement were no longer merely prisons, they were arenas of observation, of subtle strategy, where knowledge became power. She learned to predict her father's movements, anticipate his methods, and even manipulate his attention through compliance and silence. The rebellion was not violent or overt, it was a quiet, internal war, fought in moments of stillness and shadow, in the small acts of thought and observation that he could not see. In cultivating this inner resistance, she began to reclaim fragments of her autonomy, understanding that survival in the face of obsession required not only endurance but cunning, patience, and a keen awareness of the mind that sought to dominate her every action. The careful equilibrium that had governed their lives began to falter the day one of the father's experiments went horribly wrong. He had meticulously planned the procedure, convinced that he could control every variable, anticipate every response, and manipulate her body and mind according to his rigid designs. Yet, despite his calculations, something unforeseen occurred. Perhaps it was a reaction to one of the chemical concoctions he had prepared, or the strain of a mechanical device meant to measure her strength and endurance, but the result was immediate and undeniable. The daughter experienced sharp, searing pain that left her gasping and trembling, while the instruments that had always signaled precision now clattered and rattled in disarray. The father's face, usually calm and measured, betrayed a flash of shock and frustration, revealing that even his expertise had limits. It was the first time she had seen him falter, a momentary crack in the armor of authority that had dominated her entire life. In the hours that followed, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The daughter, though weak and aching, felt a subtle surge of understanding. The illusion of total control her father had cultivated so carefully was vulnerable, fallible. She began to notice signs she had previously ignored, the way his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the instruments, the way he consulted his charts repeatedly with increasing tension, the flicker of doubt in his eyes when she did not respond exactly as expected. It was a dangerous insight, one that carried both opportunity and peril, but she could not deny the empowerment that accompanied it. She began to observe him more closely, tracking his reactions to her movements, noting the patterns of his obsession and the cracks that had begun to appear. Yet the experiment's consequences were not limited to her father's shaken composure. Her body had been pushed beyond limits, leaving bruises and fatigue, subtle injuries that were invisible to casual observation but left her feeling unsteady and vulnerable. The chemical treatments, combined with the mechanical stress, had triggered a wave of discomfort that made her acutely aware of the fragility of her own existence under his hands. Each pulse of pain, each moment of weakness, became a stark reminder of the precarious balance between obedience and autonomy, between submission and survival. The miscalculation also revealed the darker aspects of her father's obsession. He became more erratic, alternating between frantic attempts to correct the procedure and an almost obsessive focus on ensuring that no evidence of the failure remained. The basement, once a controlled theater of experimentation, now held a tension that was palpable, a charged energy that seemed to hum with the failure's consequences. Shadows flickered more sharply against the walls, and the daughter began to notice that instruments were being handled with extra care, or perhaps caution, as though the very objects had absorbed the shock of what had transpired. In the wake of the failure, the power dynamics between father and daughter shifted imperceptibly but irrevocably. She realized that his obsession, though vast, was not omnipotent, and that even in a world constructed to dominate and manipulate her, there were vulnerabilities she could recognize and exploit. The experiment, though traumatic, opened her eyes to the limits of his control, revealing the subtle fractures in his meticulous designs and igniting a sense of cautious empowerment that had previously been impossible in the shadow of his relentless obsession. The revelation came slowly, like a faint light filtering through a dense canopy, yet when it settled fully in her mind, it was impossible to ignore. In the quiet hours of the night, when her father slept fitfully in the room above, she crept into the basement, guided by the knowledge she had painstakingly gathered over years of observation and silent rebellion. The instruments, the charts, and the vials no longer held the comforting, structured precision they once had, they now appeared as markers of a deeper, more disturbing truth. As she moved among them, she discovered hidden compartments, journals, and scraps of paper that had been overlooked in her careful surveillance. The words on the pages, scrawled in her father's meticulous hand, revealed experiments far more sinister than she had imagined, accounts of subjects who had vanished without explanation, and results that were recorded with the cold detachment of a man obsessed with discovery at any cost. Some of the entries contained sketches and diagrams eerily similar to her own body, tracing the trajectory of measurements and interventions over time, a record of obsession that extended beyond the bounds of care and love into something unthinkably dark. Her pulse quickened as she realized that the basement was more than a laboratory, it was a tomb of secrets, a repository of lives touched, and perhaps destroyed, by her father's unrelenting compulsion to control and manipulate. The voices she had heard in the dark, once dismissed as imagination or the echoes of fear, now seemed to gain meaning, as though they were fragments of warnings or remnants of other presences that had been ensnared in his experiments. Shadows took on a new weight, and every object in the room seemed charged with the memory of pain and suffering that had gone unacknowledged. The instruments that had once seemed coldly clinical now appeared almost sentient, silent witnesses to the unfolding horror, their gleam reflecting the faint candlelight like the eyes of creatures who had seen too much. As she pieced together the fragmented story, she began to understand the full scope of her father's obsession, how it had shaped not only her life but also the lives of others whose presence had been erased from the world. The meticulous care, the rigid schedules, and the constant scrutiny were not merely protective measures, they were components of a larger design, a compulsion to manipulate, document, and dominate bodies and minds in ways that transcended morality. She saw clearly the pattern of control, the obsession with measurement, and the relentless drive to impose order on living beings regardless of consequence. In that moment of revelation, the cabin and the forest beyond it seemed transformed. No longer were they merely isolated or oppressive, they were active participants in a hidden, horrifying reality, a world in which knowledge and curiosity had become instruments of fear and suffering. The daughter realized that her own life, so carefully monitored and manipulated, was entwined with this legacy of cruelty. The discovery left her with an inescapable truth: the man she had known as a father was also a figure of obsession and horror, and the full extent of his experiments, and the darkness they had created, was far greater than she could have imagined, stretching beyond her own existence into a legacy of secrets hidden in the woods, waiting to be uncovered.